of conflict for joining us today for our hybrid program focusing on Ukraine, what is to come. Northwestern University is proud to partner with the Irregular Warfare Initiative on important topics such as this one. For those unfamiliar with IWI, their mission is to bridge the gap between scholars and practitioners through events such as this, but also through their podcast, editorial content, and non-resident fellows program. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions for the panel, please submit comments via IWI's Twitter, which we are actively monitoring, and we will pass to them on to the panel. The session is also being recorded and will be available after today's events through the Irregular Warfare Initiative's website, social media channels. As is always the case, the views expressed today are those of the participants and do not reflect the official views of Northwestern University, West Point, Princeton University, or any other private or governmental organization, including the United States Air Force. All right, on that note, I'm William Reno. I'm a professor of political science here at Northwestern University. Seated here to my left is Major Jesse Humple, Air Force Joint Special Operations Command, Fort Bragg. John Spencer, Chair of Urban Warfare Studies, Modern War Institute at West Point. Michael Kaufman, Director of Russia Studies at Center for Naval Analysis. Jahara Frankie Matisek, U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, Military Professor at U.S. Naval War College. Alexandra Chinchilla, Professor at Texas A&M University in beautiful College Station, Texas. And Jesse Driscoll, who's a professor at University of California, San Diego. So to get things started here, I'll ask a question, take advantage of my prerogative here. And this is something that we've discussed in our classes here at Northwestern University. And that is that we thought that Russia was a master of hybrid warfare. But now when we look at Ukraine, we see trench warfare. Why doesn't Russia's war in Ukraine, at least yet, appear to master all of these mechanisms of hybrid warfare that we were taught to expect? Panelists?
So I guess I'll take the first shot at that. So there was this thing called New Generation Russian Warfare, proxy warfare, inserting political dissent, little green men, special forces. There's this old German guy that died a long time ago, actually Prussian. Clausewitz said the first problem is to identify the war you're in. So yes, hybrid warfare is a thing. It will work in some situations, but if your intent is to take an entire country by force, that's probably not going to be the primary way of warfare that will be employed. And that's what we've seen. The evolution of even just the Ukrainian war from very urbanized, where the objectives are major cities because those are the seats of political power, those are the strategic terrain, has not changed. And even though the objectives of this war have changed, but trenches still are really great defensive lines when you're exposed otherwise, and they're not going away. So that's not to say that we were doing some type of war, now we're doing trench warfare. We're actually, one, Ukraine is huge, and you can point to every type of warfare pretty much that you want to talk about in Ukraine. Why wasn't Russia the masters of war? Again, it entered into a situation where it believed the situation and the requirements it would need to do ended up being different. Its assumptions were wrong, but that's not my area of expertise, but they did run really fast into the complexity of urban terrain.
And I'd also like to point out as well, when you think about war and fighting and things of that nature, you have to remember that at a certain point, whatever you're doing, at some point, your adversary is going to develop a tactic, a response, a defensive measure. So if you were to say, yes, the Russians have been doing hybrid warfare against Ukraine and other countries for years, well, at some point, like your adversary is going to adapt, evolve, and develop a bunch of countermeasures. And so when you think about it in those terms, it should have been almost only natural that at a certain point, the comparative gains that you got from doing, the H word hybrid warfare, at some point, like there's diminishing returns, you have to do something else, right?
If I can add, so there's a couple questions there, I think, in what Will's asking us. The first is, were we right to focus on hybrid warfare? And I think folks like me in the committee were actually saying no, that this was in many ways a dead end. It was a useful term to talk about whole of government approaches to deal with military and particularly non-military measures. There's various forms of competition that fall short of war or could be considered as acts of war, but not necessarily so. That was important to galvanize government efforts, okay? But in terms of Russia as a country that is a practitioner of things like hybrid warfare, this integration of these means for the pursuit of political aims, I often thought, and I had argued this for quite a while with colleagues, that actually the focus should have been conventional warfare, that the most decisive element that achieves political aims is conventional warfare, the subsequent issue of nuclear escalation and nuclear strategy. In this war at the outset, which I actually saw, was fairly consistent, I thought, with Russian performance, which is a failure of hybrid warfare. Attempts at hybrid warfare for Russia failed early on in spring of 2014. It led to a direct conventional intervention in summer of 2014 and again in winter of 2015, right? The most decisive elements are, from my point of view, I'm a bit reductionist, conventional warfare, infantry, armor, artillery, and in this war, air power. In the Russian campaign, we can discuss the military effort, and I think if folks are interested, I'm more than happy to at least offer thoughts down the line on aspects of Russian military capability or performance that we got wrong and why and where the questions lie. One of the most fascinating things about the Russian invasion is how much the non-military end of their campaign failed to deliver, because they were banking on an FSB intelligence operation, on infiltrators, on collaborators. They thought that they had somehow gotten their way into the Ukrainian political system, that they were going to flip cities, that they were going to be able to conduct regime change in a matter of days. And whatever you may think of the initial Russian airborne assault at Hostomel, whatever you may think of the actual military campaign, the part that failed spectacularly was actually the intelligence operation. It was the saboteurs. It was the infiltrators that were supposed to be able to achieve regime change, that were supposed to marry up with the military operation and demonstrate once again, I don't know who is a master of hybrid warfare, but certainly Russia is not.
Jesse?
Agreeing pretty much with everything that was just said. I think that hybrid warfare got a lot of policy cachet because of the overwhelming success in Crimea, which is really the only place in Ukraine where they could achieve what they wanted to achieve, which in military terms, I think is basically just a coup de main. They got 100% of their objectives very, very quickly, and Ukraine had nowhere to turn. This is well documented. And as a result of that, for force posture reasons and conversations with allies, I think the language became very useful in order to change NATO conversations with the Baltic countries about how to stop that sort of thing from ever being something that could happen at low cost again. And to make sure that most of the rest of our allies felt like they would be in at least as good a position to resist that sort of aggression as the rest of Ukraine was not Crimea. That would be my first point. The second, and this is maybe a little bit more meta, but it's a political science audience, and I want to make sure that this gets said. There has been some debate among scholars about whether hybrid war is a thing at all, or whether hybrid warfare is just another, kind of made-up Washington term for something that has been going on for quite a long time, which is competition across domains, or competition in a number of different settings. If you actually go read the Gerasimov Doctrine, he's talking about how good the United States is at all this stuff. Just go read it. See if I'm making that up.
Yeah, so that actually dovetails very nicely with what I'm thinking about it. First, we have to be precise what we mean by hybrid warfare. We've already been talking about that here. But really, I think what's sort of at the heart of it is the ability to achieve political objectives without actually having to use military force. So it's a form of coercion that has military force waiting in the wings, but you're trying to shape the environment and you only want to get to that military force as sort of the last resort. So I think what's really interesting about the Ukraine conflict so far from the perspective of hybrid warfare is not actually how poorly Russia has done, but how well Ukraine has done in terms of managing that political environment in conjunction with using military force. And I think that, I mean, we just have to look at Ukrainian information ops and how it's managing the international audience and the domestic audience. And I think, to me, that really shows effective use of like that ability to move between domains and to understand that the military element is just one aspect. So that's where I think maybe I would disagree a little bit with Mike there, in that you do need to sort of be like the focus on these other domains is really important, because conventional force can only get you as far as that that ability to manipulate your own informational environment and keep your own resolve strong and alter others' perceptions of you.
Sure, but if I can just add, is working in the information domain, which is an essential component of any war. No war is just conventional war, and few conflicts are principally 100% unconventional, right? These are kind of ideal types. But does that make it a new kind of form or type of warfare, right? I mean, I know, look, in government, if you have a problem, even if it's a very old problem and you want to deal with it, you have to come up with a new name for whatever reason in order to deal with it. So you have to give it some label or tag, right? But principally what we're talking about is the fact that I think Russia's capacity to use the information domain was grossly overstated, or at least it fell flat in this specific war. Ukraine learned a tremendous amount from Russian information campaigns, and I think got much better at this than Russia and dramatically outperformed expectations in this regard. I personally don't necessarily argue for the abandonment of hybrid warfare as a term. Like, if it's useful for you, use it, go ahead. And if it's useful for your government efforts, go ahead. But I don't think it's useful as a lens to look at this war or as a framework for analysis to look at performance. I'm much more interested in military performance than the much more conventional problems.
Well, if we want to focus on the issue of military performance, I mean, let's drill down into what's been going on in recent weeks. And one question that I have is, will recent mobilization actually result in a meaningful increase in Russian military capacity? And when would we expect to see this? And I frame this in the context of the media that I and a lot of my students see, which is that this is depicted as just compounding some of the inefficiencies of Russian military organization. It doesn't seem like we've seen effectiveness from that mobilization, but I don't know. I mean, let's ask the experts. Is recent mobilization, is that going to result in meaningful increase in Russian military capacity?
I'll take a first stab at it. So, look, quantity isn't deterministic, but numbers do matter in war. Okay, they matter alongside quality. What is it likely to result in? We've yet to see. So I think a good period for evaluation is 3 to 4 months, right? Russia initially mobilized manpower in desperation to try to stabilize their lines. So they threw untrained personnel at the lines going into the winter to try to hold them. But the bulk of the manpower that they mobilize is actually still being held in reserve. It's still at training ranges. It's going to be used to raise manning levels, to rebuild units, to create reserves. What effect is it going to have? Well, military analysis is not fortune telling, so I'm afraid I can't tell you specifically. But what you can see is a couple scenarios, right? So I think perhaps the most optimistic one for Ukraine is that it doesn't go well. The Russian military is not able to sustain mobilized personnel in the winter, and parts of the lines collapse due to a breakdown in morale. I think the very pessimistic one is that mobilization generates sufficient manpower that the Russian military is able to try to go on the offensive in the spring. I also think this is unlikely because there are other constraints besides manpower, like availability of ammunition, artillery, capacity for force employment, where the likelihood that Russia can restore offensive potential, I think, probably not as high. But you can very much see a scenario that's probabilistic where it'll be sufficient for the Russian forces to consolidate defensive lines, to have a pretty high ratio of forces to the terrain they're trying to control, to have reserves, to be able to rotate troops. And it may not make a difference ultimately in the trajectory in the war, but it could extend the war by a considerable amount of time. It's very hard to ignore manpower, even if many of the intangibles and the other aspects are actually, still very favorable to Ukraine. So I hope this part makes sense. But to be frank, look, you have to appreciate uncertainty. Okay, the last time Russia really went through a mobilization like this, which is in many respects kind of a phased general mobilization, was during World War II. Okay, so amongst us, there are about 0 experts on Russian military mobilization on the scale. And the community, I think, needs to be frank that we've not seen it like this before. We've seen Ukrainian mobilization. It's a bit different, but it took months to produce really good results. And just to be a bit honest about the uncertainty and the confidence levels of what it may or may not produce for Russia. I don't think it's necessarily a game changer, but it's worth to have a cautionary note there.
I 100% agree with that. I mean, a nation's ability to wage war is made up by its means and its will. So Russia's main problem is not number of soldiers. Relative combat power analysis, even if you do it under the existing Russian force structure of the way it puts formations into the field, just bodies holding rifles isn't the number one problem. And you can't take a bunch of people, 10,000 of us, and say, poof, you're now effective fighting formation. So you can do individual replacement, you can do full unit replacement. I agree that you initially 0 to little impact, maybe hold a line that's already existing. But as the months go on, there is a question of it could have an impact. But again, I always go back to the intangibles of will to fight, and then start talking about means of not just giving them a weapon, but giving them all the other logistical supports, vehicles, tanks that they've lost. They haven't just lost soldiers. They've lost a lot of very important equipment you would need to form an offensive potential that Mike's talking about. And I still say to this day, the number one supplier of weapons to Ukraine, since they have no problem in will, but they have some problems in means, the number one supplier of weapons is Ukraine. I mean, is Russia. All the equipment that they abandoned.
You want to pick that up, or? I mean, okay, so building on the question of military mobilization, I mean, considering that in isolation, you paint a pretty grim picture from a Moscow perspective. But if I put myself in a Moscow frame and I'm thinking, okay, I'm doing mobilization because maybe I don't have a whole lot of options here. I understand my organizational problems. I mean, it looks like earlier in this conflict, a lot of the people that you would depend upon to train these new recruits they're not available because they're dead or they're injured. And I don't know if that's true across the board really and what the impact of that would be, but that doesn't look like a very good picture. So if I'm sitting in Moscow and I widen the aperture a little bit, like what is this doing? I mean, Mike, you said that it keeps it rolling for a little bit longer, but like where does that lead? I mean, what is to come? I mean, the title of the panel. I mean, I don't want to put you in a predictive mode, but
I'll buy Mike some time.
All right.
I think one thing to keep in mind is that now we are through the phase of the war, I think, where Russia can reasonably hope for its initial war aim, which was quick, cheap regime change in Kiev, which annihilates Ukraine's sovereignty, wraps the whole damn thing up quickly. Now they're in the real estate business. Now they've got these 4 new provinces that have been, according to the Russian constitution, brought into Russia, and now they're on the defensive. And holding territory, I think, is their revised war aim. This is something that was discussed earlier today, but I wanted to make sure that that was the constraint that we were talking about. So when we're trying to psychologize Vladimir Putin, as we inevitably try to do, I think it's important to think that that is the, let's call it, revised strategic war aim. I don't think that it was necessarily a wise strategic war aim, and we can talk about that at length if you want, but I think that that is the world that, at least in terms of Russia's outward-facing diplomacy, is its opening bargaining position. And Ukraine's bargaining position is that we want all that territory back. So now it is a push-pull, and that's manpower intensive if you're going to do a push-pull war with artillery as your arm of coercion.
All right. So from the perspective and the place that I sit, we observe Putin coming off at like a role. He's a winner, tough guy. So 2008 Georgia, Ukraine, and Crimea, and then Syria. He, despite the economic ramifications of the country, he's still able to say in war he wins. And this obviously we were preparing from a DoD perspective. Again, I can't speak on behalf of them, that it was going to be a much more aggressive and prosperous Russia as they entered into Ukraine. Since it didn't go that way, the most dangerous situation that we're looking at, and what we're most fearful of that he would turn to now that he is not winning anymore, is the use of tailored nuclear weapons. And the preparation for that and changing the normative argument of the use of that, because we only have an N of 1 for that globally. How a world, a Ukraine, a Europe would respond to that is the most dangerous situation from our perspective.
I'll just say on the defense. So right now, I don't think that Russia's completely in the defense. Of course, that is the goal, to reestablish those 4 oblasts. And some would argue, and I do strategic studies, that the defense is a stronger form of war. That is true, but it's not the strongest political form of war. And it's usually for only a certain amount of time. You go into defensive to prepare for something else, or not just to hold a line, unless that's the goal, is to freeze a line. And right now, he doesn't have the offensive capability to establish even the line that he signed in the constitutional, that's his. So the defense versus offense is always a tricky conversation. The ability to hold ground and take ground, that's night and day, but you still need capabilities to do both.
So I'll add to these great comments. First, I think it is true that if Russia had mobilized back in April, when it was evident that the initial invasion failed, that would have been a much more dangerous course of action, because they still had a lot of force structure in terms of officers, enlisted professionals, equipment that they could have deployed, and they might have been in a different situation come fall. They did not, thankfully. That said, I would not hand wave away the prospect of a mobilization can achieve, and neither do Ukrainians, right? I think just based on my experience in Ukraine, people there, naturally, defense establishments prepare for worst case scenarios, not to win the lottery, and understand that at the very least, mobilization may allow Russia to dramatically extend the defense, right? And if the Russian strategy, at least maybe as I perceive it, is to try to extend the war, make economic sustainability of the war more challenging, and make it more difficult to materially support Ukraine, because much of Ukraine's effort at the end of the day, putting aside the Ukrainian will to fight and their own capacity to do it, very much hinges on external material support, on ammunition, on equipment, on most things, believe it or not, on even money to sustain the GDP, the actual government budget. And that's a question of material availability. Do we have the ammunition? Turns out we make a lot less than we need to. Our defense industrial capacity for prolonged conventional wars is woefully inadequate, and we can put that aside for another conversation. And the second one's of policy. Will Europeans, will other countries actually give these things? You see Ukrainians desperately trying to get tanks from Germany. Germany is saying, I won't give you tanks unless America gives you tanks, right? And Ukraine sort of, in some ways, I think, trapped in this Kafkaesque triangle of trying to get more equipment, because what if mobilization does create these challenges, right? Ukraine, I think, is trying to build out more operational formations. They need equipment from the West. Is it going to get it? Point being is that the Russian vision is clear to try to extend the war and then try to attack Ukrainian critical infrastructure to make it much more costly, much more challenging, right? And the reason I say this is basically to say, look, when you make assumptions, you need to have things you're looking to see which trajectory or which scenario that's potentially going. I laid out 3. I'm not saying it's only 3 possible scenarios, but you have to distill it down to something. And it'll be good to basically, at least I have my own thoughts or indicators of what would be useful to look at to see the trajectory of this war, at least in the next 4 months. And for myself, I'm probably looking more towards end of February to get a sense of what the sort of coming months or year might bring.
I mean, this suggests that maybe the discussion about hybrid warfare is actually not over, because if the objective from a Kremlin perspective is to extend the timeline of the war, I mean, I think that, Alex, you made an important point earlier, which is that hybrid warfare, I mean, the essence of it is to bend the adversary to your political will without a direct application of force. And if the engine that is driving Ukrainian sustainability along with their own will to fight, but the provision of material is support from the West, then wouldn't that be an objective in an overall Kremlin strategy? They don't have to win on the battlefield. What they have to do is they have to win in the politics of support for Ukraine. I mean, how do you react to that? How do you see that playing out? Is that, I mean, you know, speaking to Mike's scenarios.
Yeah, so okay. Hi. Okay. So I think that's totally the weak link there. Because I can't underscore enough what Mike said earlier, which is that Western support is making the whole train drive. And not just even in like the material aspects of it, which are so critical, but also the political support, the economic support, the unprecedented intelligence sharing, the like even remote military advising, which is occurring as well. And so it's just really so comprehensive. And I think that things are not perhaps as bleak as they looked before the midterms. I think maybe if things have sort of broken another way, we might expect a more like precipitous decline in American support, at least for backing Ukraine. But you're already starting to see some of the calls for that. So like Kevin McCarthy has been saying, calling for increased transparency about how Ukraine is using the aid, talking about corruption. And so some of these proposals that are being tossed around could all be good things to increase transparency. But if it's a harbinger of kind of the political mood already beginning to shift, then I think that's exactly what Russia is hoping for. Just, as we were talking earlier, just to run out the clock. If it can just outlast U.S. support and U.S. support to decline in any particular way, things like NASAMS to protect against the Ukrainian airspace. If any part of that U.S. resolve falters there, then Russia can really step up, I think, conventional punishment on Ukrainian cities, and the war effort will not be as strong.
I mean, NATO's got a bunch of members and there's one Russia. And one of the things that we learn in political science is that the larger number of actors you have, the harder it is to coordinate cooperation. So if I'm sitting in Moscow and I'm trying to think like a man in Moscow would think, I'm not a bad person, but sometimes I have to think, what would a bad person do? And I think it'd be a really good strategy to just keep it rolling, because you don't have to succeed in the battlefield. What you have to do is you have to succeed politically. And looking at NATO, I don't think that every NATO country has the same assessment of risk as maybe NATO countries in Eastern Europe. And that's all something that I can exploit. There's always going to be another election. There isn't going to be other elections in the same sense in Russia. So I would view that maybe as a strength on my part, thinking about it from Moscow. So I don't know, force structures and stuff like that. Maybe I don't need an offensive breakthrough in Ukraine. But looking at that political terrain, I mean, how do you folks who spend more time analyzing this sort of stuff than I do? I mean, how do you look at that, say, from a Washington perspective, or planning in the military?
Well, I mean, ultimately, this question will be answered over the glacial long term, probably, because Russia's probably not going to disappear and will continue to share a border with Ukraine, which is probably not going to disappear. And if you just compare material, Russia outweighs Ukraine, but Russia is outweighed by Ukraine plus the whole West. And that arithmetic is not going to change, period. So the question becomes whether you can subdivide the West. And that has been the case since NATO was founded. essentially. These aren't new problems. And I think that what is really new is having an actor in the Kremlin that is willing to actually run the experiment of saying, okay, how long before you actually run out of ammo? And I don't even know who you is that I'm talking to. You, over there in the West, you, all of you. I'm not talking to Washington, I'm talking to you. And that is an empirical question, actually. That is a question that is not just going to be answered, on a panel. That is a question that's going to get answered in terms of the defense industrial bases of European allies and the United States. And luckily, those allies are growing, and their defense budgets seem to be growing too. But I've heard that before.
So on this question of whether you can win every battle but lose the war, or it doesn't matter if you lose every battle, you might lose the war. I think that this actually goes against, if the strategy is to prolong it, if you keep losing ground and keep losing battles, that gives a lot more hope to the supporters of Ukraine that they could end this quicker and get, if they take back more and more ground. I mean, I think that's why, again, Putin's goal is to not freeze as in the winter, but slow this down to hit at that resolve. I also think that if that was Kremlin's strategy, then why would you do things like make massive missile attacks during major international meetings to only seemingly go against that and harden the resolves of supporters of Ukraine?
I just had maybe a brief one finger, which is to say that my general experience, at least observing this conflict, has been that first, it's actually remarkable how much the United States and other European countries and Western countries writ large are able to do much more than we think we're able to do, are able to maintain political cohesiveness. And a lot of the early predictions that there'll be these breaks, these fractures, that they won't be successfully managed politically, they're just consistently proven wrong. And a lot of Russian expectations that material assistance and that political consensus on assistance for Ukraine won't last have also been proven wrong. Right. That said, my own view, kind of looking at this, is that there are a number of factors, but the most significant variable is the United States. And I don't say that as a sort of like chauvinistic American with typical like Washington, D.C. view that we're the most important and nothing happens without us. But the truth is that the United States is the most important contributor materially to the conflict. But more importantly, the United States is in a leading coordinating role when it comes to military assistance. And secondarily, many countries seem like they will not give or contribute things that we will not give or contribute. That is, they're in a politically reactionary mode relative to our decisions. Okay, so in this particular conflict case, I think we are the most significant variable in terms of our politics. My view is, and I try to stay away from political analysis as much as I can, is that I don't see any change in that after the midterm elections. That's my own personal view with respect to policy or material assistance to Ukraine.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Frankie, did you want to jump in?
No.
So let me say one more thing quickly. I completely concur, but I think that is accurate probably for the next 3 to 5 years. And I think that 5 years out from now, if Ukraine is at risk of running out of ammo, I think there are just a lot of Americans who are going to wonder why that is the case. And our European friends and allies have, particularly but not exclusively, on the Eastern Front, really stepped up and opened the cupboards and given what they have to Ukraine, to the fight. The government of Poland, for instance, has been fairly explicit about saying, we consider this a Polish fight that happens to be taking place on Ukrainian territory. Quite a statement. Not the kind of thing you would expect the American government to say, but we have these modes, right? Poland's geography is different than America's geography. So in a very real sense, speaking as an Illinois taxpayer here, this is a European problem. And it is reasonable for Americans to expect Europeans to shoulder some of the burden for paying for a European security problem. These are not poor countries. These are countries that are very capable and have a defense industrial base, and they could solve some of these problems. Not tomorrow, not next year even, but 5 years from now, there's a reasonable question about who ought to be paying for all of this. And I think that it is not unpatriotic or a result of nefarious Russian hybrid warfare for Americans to ask those questions. I mean, this is just regular alliance maintenance stuff. We don't have synonymous interests with Ukraine. Neither does France, neither does Germany, neither does Portugal, neither does Albania, neither does Estonia, right? I mean, but not all those countries have big industrial bases that can produce 155, and some of them do. So we have allowed, we the Americans have allowed Europeans to become very dependent on the American security umbrella with some consequences. And I think part of the result of this war is going to be an unpacking of those consequences and like a democratic debate about those consequences. And part of my beef with the language of hybrid warfare, not to get back on that horse, is that I think it warps that conversation, where if you say anything that moves off of the official government talking points on NATO, you are accused of participating as a fifth columnist in Russian hybrid warfare. And I don't know that that's healthy. I don't know that that's a healthy way to structure the conversation. So I'll leave it at that. Other than to say, if you, again, this is just facts of the matter. Everything that you want to know about European force structure can come down by just looking carefully to what European governments have given up. When you're talking about like 1/3 of the long-range artillery that France has is gifted to Ukraine. That sounds like a lot. And then you count it and it's actually, 12 Caesar howitzers. That tells you everything you need to know about what Europe has done to its defense industry, and and that's why everyone's looking at the United States. And Mike, respectfully, it doesn't have to be that way. You know that, I know that. I think we probably agree on that, but I just wanted to make sure that was made clear to anyone listening out there in the audience.
No, I agree. I think those are very well made points. And in general, as we march into the next year, I think there's going to have to be a very serious conversation on the balance of U.S. versus European military effort, ramping up ammunition production, and countries giving not just things they're willing to give or that they can easily dispose of from their arsenals. Many countries gave away, particularly Central Eastern European countries, gave away older Soviet equipment they inherited in the hope of getting more modernized NATO equipment, which wasn't exactly 100% altruistic. We're going to have to get to a place where European countries, they want to help sustain the war, will give away equipment they actually want and like for their force structure, and we'll take money to replace, but they're going to have to shell out too.
Going back to this political dimension of the war, and if I'm thinking of like the guy in Moscow, then yeah, it's a bad equation at the outset. I mean, Russia's GDP is about 5% of collective NATO GDP. So, that looks pretty bad on paper. But, if I've held territory in Ukraine up to this point, I mean, it seems like the focus of the conflict, the logic suggests that it has to shift more and more to this political dimension. I mean, if you want to call it hybrid warfare or whatever, because it's hard for me to look at this and not be drawn to this logic of how do I test the varied thresholds of risk in all of these different NATO countries. Like that seems like it should be the key to solving this dilemma for Russia. And if I look at this war in Ukraine, but not just as Ukraine, but Russia's overall strategic objectives, one of which is to fragment NATO. I mean, could I use this war in Ukraine to fragment NATO? I mean, is that still a possibility? And what would that look like?
I mean, it's going to be information operations. It's also going to be the strangling of energy markets and, trying to squeeze the Europeans on, you're going to be really cold this winter. Or if you want to even make even more long term, can your country really afford to have, increases in defense budgets when you can't afford your pensions, you can't afford your health care? There's a lot I think the Kremlin can do to cause maybe different election outcomes by virtue of telling the average person in Paris or Brussels, hey, your free college may not be free in 10 years if you continue this war against Russia.
Let me turn up the temperature a little bit. If I think of this logic of exploiting, trying to highlight differences in risk assessment thresholds, why don't I explode a nuclear device somewhere? Some sort of demonstration, because I don't think in France they're going to think about that in the same way that somebody in Poland is going to think about that. And I think in France, there are going to be a lot of people that are going to say, I wish this thing in Ukraine had never happened. We need to walk away from this. I mean, am I wrong, or is that logic there?
No, I mean, there is logic there of nuclear blackmail and, you know, the possibility of maybe a 1 or 2 kilogram nuclear weapon being set off in Ukraine, and the impact that would have not just in Europe, but just on the global economy. I mean, that's why the U.S. and NATO has to play that escalation ladder game with the Russians. That's why you know, like Ukrainians didn't get HIMARS like the first week of the war. You basically have to play that game with the Kremlin, and at this point, it's you're trying to avoid it, but then you don't want to give that the upper hand, like to Putin in that sense.
So for me, a two-part question on the NATO thing. If that was a strategic goal, it's a complete failure. As just increased the size of NATO, he just increased the resolve of NATO. NATO was fading as a organization of use. Nobody's funding it. He just made it stronger than it's ever been since its creation. On the nuclear one, I think that is a great conversation to have with an understanding of the evolution of the theory of nuclear weapons deployment on a battlefield from the first time they're used to the evolution of where we were in Eastern Europe. Tactical nuclear weapons were just big artillery pieces that would be used in battles. And now that evolution has gone away. The same global norms in which have allowed Putin to do the things so far in Ukraine are the same ones that deter any use of a weapon of mass destruction in Europe, because of that would then open the gates. The same thing with the escalation ladder. If we do certain things to assist Ukraine, if Russia would open that gate, I believe he's a rational actor and knows that would then, even a small yield tactical nuclear weapon, I think enough signaling has been done to hopefully the risk calculation is that would change all the rules that we're currently fighting the war by.
I mean, it's that Article 5 question. Is Article 5 how strong is Article 5? How credible is Article 5? I mean, we saw a Russian-made missile fragment, I guess, land in NATO territory. So, the experts are looking at that and making their decisions. But again, I mean, if I'm sitting in France, I mean, is Article 5 a mutual suicide pact? I mean, that calls the question. I'm borrowing somebody else's term on that. So I just think that if I'm sitting in Moscow and I'm looking at it through my Moscow eyes, and I'm thinking I am boxed in my original military strategy, what I have to do is I have to go asymmetric. I have to expand the battle space. And if I'm expanding the battle space, that battle space is political. And one of the most political instruments I have is nuclear weapons. And, maybe I've got gas pipelines, but you only fire that weapon once. And it seemed like that weapon didn't work. I mean, what other weapons are there? I just am surprised that there isn't more discussion about this logic, and maybe there is in some quarters, but I'm curious to know how these experts would react to that.
Yeah, so I just want to make 2 quick points. So the one is on sort of the nuclear blackmail point, and it's essentially coercion. I mean, if you get to the point you're using a nuclear weapon, you've already failed at whatever you're trying to do, and you're going to provoke this dramatic response, which I think that, at least for me, it doesn't seem credible. There wouldn't be a strong U.S. and other NATO countries response, at least in the conventional domain. So the point is basically, the way I see it is as some of the people, the folks here have already mentioned, is to kind of keep a cap on what U.S. support looks like for Ukraine in the war. There's a reason why Ukraine doesn't have the kind of weapons that could reach territory inside Russia, and why the U.S. doesn't want to sell it to them. And that and the U.S. has done a lot of work to try to keep the other NATO allies that are a little bit more gung-ho about this in check. The second point about Article 5 is, I do think it going back to what I just said, I do think it's credible, but the nice part about Article 5 is it's on a cut and dry prescription of what is going to happen. It's an opportunity for the NATO states to figure out how they want to respond. And the United States in particular has shown extreme, I think, care to look at what the escalation potential could be for this conflict.
So again, this is not my area of expertise. A lot of people have asked that question. I think it goes back to the whole, what is this about? Is this about Ukraine? Is this about Russia's recolonization? If a nuclear armed state is allowed to use nuclear terrorism to achieve its political goals, even overriding things like the UN Charter, then that puts us at more danger of nuclear warfare than proceeding with aiding Ukraine and defending itself. Those are the rules of the book right now. The use of nuclear terrorism is outside that book. The nuclear weapon is a weapon of survival. Nobody is threatening Russian borders, in my definition.
So maybe I'll chime in briefly. It's been a wonderful conversation, I think, back and forth. For me, first the question on nuclear use, and let's discuss the risk of nuclear escalation. We shouldn't overstate it, but realistically, since the Russian regime has fully committed itself to the war in September through mobilization, through enactment of wartime measures, and through annexation, essentially severing their ability to revise minimal war aims at this point in negotiation, I think it's fair to say that the long-term risk of nuclear escalation has increased. How much? I'm not going to assign sort of random numbers to it. Maybe you all have your own number in mind, but I'll tell you that even from past nuclear crises, such as maybe the Berlin crisis, a lot of people considered back then 5% to be a fairly high chance of nuclear escalation, or at least a reasonably high one. All right. That said, I don't think that this war necessarily goes in one of two trajectories. But I get the impression a lot of people do, that they have a bias towards one of two outcomes. One, pessimistic, being nuclear escalation and the uncertainty that brings with it. Another, also potentially pessimistic, which is stalemate, inevitable stalemate, right? And maybe there's a third trajectory of bias, which is unequivocal Ukrainian military victory without either of those two outcomes. Fine. In the event of nuclear escalation, I think it's the most important two questions are, first, what does Ukrainian leadership choose to do? I actually don't know why the conversation first goes to NATO. Like, in the event nuclear weapons are used against Ukraine, the first question is, what does Kyiv want to do, right? Or at least they're directly threatened, incredibly threatened nuclear weapons. The second question is only, what does the United States choose to do? No offense to a lot of colleagues in NATO, but that to me is fundamentally the most important question. And a lot will follow from that. I won't get into the scenarios of potential nuclear use. I will say, from my point of view, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty there. It's a real challenge when you think about the proposition of a country that's forced to use nuclear weapons, the conditions they'll use them under, right? In this case, it is most likely the collapse of Russian military forces and the Russian military effort in theater. It's clearly not an operational defeat. They've had plenty of it, right? It's fair to say it's not that. So then the question really goes, to what extent can you deter a country that's politically desperate? To what extent you can threaten conventional attack as a useful form of deterrence against a military that's already been defeated? Because you're essentially threatening to defeat a military twice. It's not actually the most coercive deterrent you can come up with, but I'm just being very frank about it. It's a daunting proposition. And I've heard a lot of folks come up with, to a high degree of confidence in terms of U.S. options, what the U.S. might do, what effect it would be. And I just have to tell you, that is, from my point of view, a very uncertain space, and hopefully we won't get that. On alliance cohesion and whatnot, I fully agree with John. I don't think this war has been able to fragment NATO, but it's done a really good job of expanding it. And with respect to the long-term economic prospects, I think those are very well-made points, because if the energy crisis sends Europe into a recession following this winter, which it likely will, the question is, can Europe get through the next winter the way it got through this winter? Buying up all the gas they could at maximum price, at cost. I'm skeptical of that. And as next winter approaches, the question then will be, will they be willing to provide the economic assistance to Ukraine, given the budget problems and shortfalls and economic issues they themselves have, right? I suspect that that is really the Russian game. That is the Russian strategy. That's what they're hoping for, right? And there's a good chance that we'll be able to muddle through. One of the interesting things I think about U.S. NATO and this entire effort is whatever pessimism is out there, we've shown a tremendous capacity to muddle through and to keep it going. So probably just as Europeans got somehow to this winter, maybe they'll find a way to get through. I don't know.
So I'm also, just to put cards on the table, fairly optimistic about the muddling through as my most likely future scenario. It's not the most dangerous, but it is the most likely. And I think I want to just make two simple points. You asked the question rhetorically, Will, like what else can he do other than use nuclear weapons? And I think that is an irresponsible question to ask rhetorically. I think that there's an awful lot of things Russia could do between now and nuclear weapons. And so I don't want that to linger in the ether of the internet as if, it's a rhetorical question that answers itself. It's absolutely not. And there's a ton of stuff Russia can do between what it has currently done and dropping a tactical nuke, at the end of, some long chain of consequences. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But I mean, I don't want to enumerate the list fully of things they could do that they haven't done yet, but like, come on. Yeah, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them, right?
And I'm wondering
Full
why they
stop.
haven't.
They haven't because I think that there's some good chance that they actually like the war they have. That what they actually have is a war that is contained to Ukraine, where the costs, the human costs and the economic costs are concentrated in Ukraine, and the West eventually notices that it has to rebuild that thing and then doesn't want to do it. And that Russia can tear it down faster than we can rebuild it. And as long as it stays contained to Ukraine, which is a central NATO goal, then they can just kind of keep this going and eventually punt the costs of rebuilding onto the future generations of alliance taxpayers, which itself is leverage on the alliance. And they get that for free without dropping a nuclear weapon. That is one thing they could do. Okay, there's a bunch of other things they could do. I don't know how useful it is to talk about them, but there are a bunch of other things they could do. Zoom. Second, I think that we're talking about nuclear use as if it's like Vladimir Putin wakes up some morning and is like, you know what, this is the day. I knew it. It was like, I'm going to drop that bomb today because I've been planted this, I've had a circle on my calendar. I don't think that's how this is going to happen. We have quite a bit of research that is all on near misses, and to your point that it's an N of 1, I concede that is true. But there's been a lot of research on the near misses about how we accidentally almost used nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and it scares the hell out of you. Because what you find out is that the way that it probably happens is some sleepy airline pilot or some flock of birds that somebody thought was an incoming missile, or it was some set of standard operating procedures that were put in place that are actually being made under great pressure, like minutes, not hours of pressure, by people who have operational command authority. Russia is very close to this war zone. And if you just do some algebra on how fast these missiles move, Russians are the ones making those decisions real fast. And I have that in my head as the most likely way that we end up actually having nuclear use, not some political coercive decision, which is a very different model, respectfully, John, than terrorism. Like your whole language of if there's this, one man using nuclear terrorism, what's that going to do to the regime? That's one kind of risk, and I will concede that it is a real risk. I'm not trying to trivialize it. There's a different kind of risk, which is just the risk of an ongoing conflict. This is what Schelling was talking about when he talked about the threat that leaves something to chance. This is why actual contests between nuclear powers are competitions in your threshold for risk tolerance. I will now stop speaking.
Great. Spot that, or I can follow up because if I'm looking at this conflict up to this point, how many of you on this panel 48 hours ago were discovered that you had a higher intensity of interest or more claims on your time? you know, the missile fragments in Poland or whatever it was, turns out maybe not to be so significant, but I'm also thinking back, was it last month, the aircraft over the Black Sea? So you have a UK military aircraft, and I believe it was, missile was fired at it. And this missile came from a Russian aircraft. I mean, it seems like that creates a dilemma. I mean, I think that in Jesse's model, that the longer the conflict goes on, the more opportunities you have to play that game. So, you know, at this point, I mean, how much does that keep you awake at night?
Nothing keeps me awake.
So Mr. Chairman, I have a heretical view on this, okay? I don't think wars have accidental causes. Leaders use force because they feel they must to achieve political aims, okay? The notion that accidents cause wars, I think from my point of view, is fundamentally historical. So if there's an incident, like there was an incident the other night, and it turned out by the looks of it, it's Ukrainian S-300 air defense system missiles. But even if it wasn't, even if it was a Russian cruise missile that landed in Polish territory, yes, there likely would have been Article 4 consultations. They've happened plenty of times before. I discovered from reading the internet, a lot of people don't know about Article 4. In fact, they probably didn't ask themselves why there's an Article 5, because there must be 4 articles before it. And it's interesting what they say too. And that the way NATO is structured, it's not literally anything happens and then it's Article 5 and then NATO goes to war. That's not how the alliance works. And so from my point of view, what would have happened? There would have been Article 4 consultations, and then what? If you think that NATO would have gone to war with Russia because a fragment of a cruise missile landed in Polish territory, I think this profoundly is just an incorrect assumption. From my point of view, that as long as two things hold true, right? That Russia is either deterred or sees no benefit from going to war with NATO or attacking NATO member territory. And I think there's few things that are as good a deterrent as NATO and, more importantly, US security commitments and guarantees. And second, that NATO has no interest of going to war with Russia or directly intervening in a way that would put it in combat with Russian forces, that accidents aren't likely to take us there, okay? Which is not a license, right? So often, like, you know, you can reduce this to a sort of license to engage in all sorts of reckless behavior. It is not, because that behavior in of itself over time can create a context, right? But I don't think accidents are what's going to get us there. And I wanted to just remark at the end of sort of the last round questioning, I think have two theories on why Russia hasn't done some of the things they thought they might do to escalate, like all those things between the war where it is now and just nuclear use, which is where we shot up to very rapidly, right, in our discussion. The first is frankly because they might be deterred, because we could do quite a few things back to them, and they actually like the war as it is, as my colleague rightfully said it here. The deterrence does work. We can do some of these things back to Russia. I don't think they necessarily want to tango with us in some of these domains on the assumption that they're actually better positioned in them. The second one is that in many respects, those things they can do are probably far more useful as deterrents and shaping factors for our own decision making, right? Rather than and having the ambiguity of the extent to which they would be effective, rather than using them, finding out that maybe they're not as effective they suspect, they were more resilient, or they were fine, but the effect is temporal, right? And then that's it. And actually leads to another cycle of escalation that's not necessarily to Russia's benefit. So often leaving that in reserve and letting the other side wonder and debate what the efficacy might be of those measures is more effective than just, you know, firing them out, right? So these are my two hypotheses. One is that they're deterred, and the other one is that they're actually reserving this to deter us to some extent.
So I agree, and I just want to put stomp on the particular point of the missile. I think it's actually a useful thing to keep focused on, because it draws our attention to a particular kind of uncertainty, which is it's just very hard to know, even if you're working very hard to sort the fact from the fiction on Twitter and you're researching this full time. It's just difficult to know what's going on way up in the upper atmosphere. It's a domain that is not like the land domain in that respect. You could say the same thing about the cyber domain, the space domain, or the deep undersea cables domain. I said, who really knows what's going on? And those risks, that space of competition is going to not magically go away no matter what happens in Ukraine. So that at some level, this is just risk that is baked into a turn towards great power attention in our security conversation. It shouldn't be held hostage by the outcome in the Eastern Donbass. Nonetheless, these are real risks. These are ongoing, persistent risks of the environment and the conflict. And it's hard to have cooperative conversations about things with Russia as long as they are so focused on this particular, pathologically focused on this particular issue. So I'll leave it at that.
So I think they're really related. The possibility of spillover, whether it's a NATO fighter or a NATO person dying, this spilling outside of a war inside Ukraine, I think that's strongly tied to the rule set in which a nuclear weapon could feasibly be used, but based on a political risk calculation. This war, although infuriating, is being conducted under a set of global international rules. Both sides are agreeing to them, but in a sense, no, they're not, because Russia's waging a war that was multiple organizations were designed to prevent a stronger nuclear powered country invading another one, but then wants to play by the rules of which the two nuclear arms will act in this way. This is not your fight. I'm not going to follow any rule of law, international humanitarian law. There's nothing you can do about it. I think that's closely tied to the nuclear saber rattling, because you can't win militarily, and the possibility of spillover, which would then enact a change in the current rule set, which are, some of them are self-constrained, like what weapons the United States will give Ukraine, even though it's under the rule set of, well, you can give them anything as long as you're not directly engaging in hostilities. But Kremlin signals, if you give that weapon, I won't name what weapon it is, then I must resort to my own survival, which is nuclear saber rattling. It's the infuriating part, and I don't play with game theory anymore, that there are a set of rules, and everybody's really scared that there will be a break of that rule, such as a spillover, which then enacts these other set of rules over here with NATO and everybody else.
But that's the Schelling thing. How close to the edge do you get? And I think it's not moving towards that outcome where you're moving to the edge of a cliff, but rather it's a slope, right? I mean, so that slope gets steeper and steeper. And one of the things that's, I think, particularly struck me about this conflict is there's been a lot of red lines. And we kept busting through red lines really early on in terms of the stuff that we were supplying. I was really surprised that the Russians were bluffing. And then, the guy in the Kremlin, he made a bunch of nuclear threats. And I don't know, nuclear threats, that definitely gets my attention. And it seems like it's not an everyday thing. And gee, that's kind of a surprise. And then the guy turns out he was bluffing, I guess. So now I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe I should give the Ukrainians some weapons that can really hit logistics centers inside Russia. Because everything I've done up to this point, I mean, this is just an incremental increase. I mean, should I give weapons to the Ukrainians so that they can disrupt logistics and otherwise across the border in Russia, Beograd aside? I mean, because already there have been strikes, as far as I know, from media inside Russia. In fact, strikes maybe quite deep inside Russia. So I think the guy in the Kremlin's bluffing. We should give them more weapons. What do you say to that? We have to boost their capability. We don't want this war to go on forever. We want the Russians to negotiate. We had a whole bunch of people
smiling. It's not going to take us to a good place. Very happy with your question.
I'm not. So you added a couple words. I was very happy. Like yes.
Okay, all right,
No,
so.
I 100% agree that this war should end sooner than later, and that's one of the issues with even the Poland situation. Whether there's actually it was caused by Russia's illegal war. United Nations votes overwhelmingly that the annexation is a fraud, is not legal in global sense. Should we give Ukraine weapons in which it can hit deeper into Ukraine to hit Russian logistics that it currently can't, like the ATACMS app? I personally, not representing anybody, 100%. And I think that these victories that Ukraine has had on the battlefield are investments in the trust bank. The whole argument about hitting into Russia, there are, from the Kharkiv Oblast, I can launch a mortar into Russia. That's almost like an irrational line of thought. Do we trust that our partner in Ukraine would use weapons that provided from anybody to attack into Russia? Or would they use those longer ranging systems to achieve battlefield gains on their stated strategic objective? And this is where I think we've actually cowered to the Kremlin's basically don't do that. Like, why is the range of that weapon? Literally, it makes no sense. I can sit on your border. I can hit Russia from here with a mortar. But if I give them this thing that would actually give them a battlefield advantage, then that's you giving weapons to actually threaten the survival of Russia. To me, it doesn't make a common sense test. So I answer that 100% yes. Give them things that we won't give them now for a political risk reason, so they can end the war sooner. As in what does that look like though? To regain territory, they need a couple tools we won't give them.
I mean, I want to punch them in the face and end this war quick, because the longer it goes, the more opportunities we have for states. And this seems to be part of this nuclear threat. I mean, if accidental war is really where it's at. We have a question from the Twitterverse, and I encourage other folks out there
There's a gentleman right there.
in the world, and
A real world question.
we'll
Twitter isn't real.
we'll do real world first. So Ricardo,
Yeah, so can we tease this out, right? Because can we tease this out, this idea of what the rules are here? So the Kremlin wants to say that this is a proxy war between Russia and the West, and the West is saying no, we're just
is the
supporting Ukraine.
Twitterverse question. Excellent. Okay.
Right. So, but on the other hand, we're not giving this super high range artillery. So, what is the rule here? Is there a coherent set of rules? Are we saying to Ukraine, you can't strike within Russia, and if you do, then we're going to stop supporting you? Well, doesn't that play into the claim that Russia is making, that this is a proxy war between the U.S. or the West more broadly and Russia?
And why wouldn't the Russian leadership then take the war to the West?
So a lot of things to unpack there. I'll answer this because my work is actually on proxy war. And so part of it is like, I think part of the way people are talking about this is because proxy war comes out of the Cold War context, right? And the way it's typically thought of is that two states that can't fight each other directly because they're worried about escalation are fighting each other through this local partners on the ground, right? And so I think why many people close to the US government don't want to call it that is because the idea is, we're not in Ukraine because we want to fight Russia. We're in Ukraine because we want to defend Ukraine. And if Russia would just, kindly remove itself, then we wouldn't be in this situation at all. Versus in the Cold War context, the proxy war is very much about trying to achieve relative gains vis-a-vis this opponent. When we think of it from a more academic perspective, by any dimension you could possibly think of, Ukraine is a proxy war, just because it literally is a local proxy that's on the ground that is getting every conceivable level of support, basically, except very high-end military equipment, and actual boots on the ground. They're doing advising. They're just like, they're on Skype and they can only check in, once a day. And you don't have boots on the ground or air power, but you have basically every other dimension that you can conceivably think of in a proxy war of the kinds of support that states tend to provide in these sort of situations. And then some people say, well, proxy wars, they only have, they're only like in a civil war context, but also that's not really the case. Like there are other proxy wars that, we study that you see actual, boots on the ground by one or more sides. So I think that another interesting thing, if we do think about it, that I think some of that proxy war literature really highlights is that anytime you have that relationship between local partners on the ground and external forces that are working with them, there are always going to be some sort of conflicts of interest. And I think the Ukraine and US case is no different, and that there are serious, like, and, you know, Jesse alluded to this earlier, there are serious differences in terms of, you know, what the US wants and what Ukraine might want to achieve out of the conflict. And so I think that the United States is much more concerned about the risk of escalation. It doesn't necessarily want Ukraine to retake all of its territory. It's like not willing to pay the risks of that, versus Ukraine has put that as a stated goal. And then when you see things like, for example, that Ukraine does the security services probably potentially were behind the, you know, attack on Daria Dugina that killed her, the US quietly releases information that's basically like, don't do this. You did this. We know you did it. Please stop.
No, and I think to what you're getting at, this is the fog and friction of war. And actually, last week we were just teaching like Cuban Missile Crisis at the Naval War College, and the reason why you kind of get really close to nuclear war is because there was no backdoor communication going on. And it sounded like early on in the Russian-Ukraine war, there wasn't any backdoor communication. But it sounds like the last few months, it sounds like there is communication going on between the Kremlin and Washington. And I think at least helps sort of prevent the escalation. But I mean, I can guarantee you those conversations definitely involve, well, Russia, if you do this, or if you hit this many things, then maybe we will consider giving the Ukrainians a weapon system that takes the range out farther. That's the tough thing here is that there are these phone calls going on every week that we are not privy to, and if we were, we wouldn't be allowed to talk to them anyways. But I think it is really important about it's the managing of risk, the uncertainty. I mean, this probably won't be the last time that a random munition, either from Russia or Ukraine, lands in a NATO territory. And the question is, was it really intentional? What does the Kremlin say or do to signal about it was an accident? Do they say nothing? Do they blame the Ukrainians? Do people actually try to do Article 5? But Article 5 just means we all get together and say we're going to do a mean tweet against the Russians, right? Because that could be an Article 5 response. We're all going to get on Twitter and say something really mean to the Russians, and that's the end of Article 5. So I think that is the other part of this equation of what you're getting at is, you know, if the Ukrainians are going to start hitting things deeper and deeper inside of Russia, we're probably going to tell them you just can't use anything that has, that was made by the Americans or by NATO. So you need to use your own stuff for that.
You're just moving closer to that edge. I mean, I'm a child of the Cold War, and I'm hearing all this stuff about proxy war and incentives to escalate and nuclear threats. At which point, sort of in the classical Cold War education I had, it's like danger, danger, danger. And in fact, it seems like it's even worse in some ways. I mean, during the Cold War, we knew which side was east and we knew which side was west. And now what we have is we have a conflict over whose sphere of influence is that centrally located place. I mean, you know, we knew in Berlin when there was a challenge. We had that line that was drawn after World War II, but we don't even have the line now. So I'm just seeing danger, danger. Maybe it's because I'm sitting here in Chicago and I'm an academic and so forth. Mike, you had a follow up, and then we'll go to another question out here in the audience.
Yeah, I just had a brief follow-up. It was to the prior conversation, which is first that I don't think there are rules. I don't think we should assume that that's far too comforting and stabilizing, right? I think there are efforts on the part of if not both sides, certainly our side at escalation management, which to a degree is intra-war deterrence. And I wouldn't necessarily call it an informal understanding, but it seems that the war is sort of hobbling along, or we're muddling through with a series of understandings that managing escalation is an imperative, right? That said, the longer the war goes on, the more we are a bit in a spiral decision-making model, right? That wars are fundamentally unstable systems when it comes to escalation. And that's why I'm saying from that outset that we should not say there are rules. I don't think if we asked for the list of rules for this war, we would find a document. Well, maybe there would be one. It would be entirely white and empty. The second point I wanted to make, and this is regarding some of the discussion of escalation. I feel that let's put aside the proxy war conversation because I definitely think we're in this war to defend Ukraine, but the Secretary of Defense was very clear that part of U.S. policy and strategy is to weaken Russia, right? So there's more than one objective in the U.S. material assistance to Ukraine, and we, along with many other countries, are de facto material parties to this war. That's a very, very fair depiction of the situation. So I think that we're balancing, between three parts, right? And maybe it's best to think of a triangle, or maybe I just think of triangles and it helps me visually think this way. The first is strategic defeat for Russia, okay? And you can define that differently. Different countries define that differently. Perhaps at a bare minimum, it is denying Russia the benefits of aggression in Ukraine, right? Perhaps more to the maximum, it is exhausting Russian military capacity, so Russia is unable to shape European security and engage in this kind of aggression for, let's say, a decade, something like that. But it's a strategic defeat for Russia, and different countries have different views on what that means. The second is victory for Ukraine, right? And victory for Ukraine is first and foremost defined by the Ukrainians, and they actually have pretty clear political objectives in this war, right? But the closer they may come to achieving them, the more there may be some disagreement or some misalignment with other countries who are supporting them. And the reason for that is the third part, which is the imperative of escalation management, which is also a priority for the United States. It may be a lesser priority for other countries, right? Perhaps different countries who are involved prioritize one side of this much more with other, right? But that being said, to me, I think that's what we're balancing between, right? At least that's my intellectual framework for looking at the conflict and the dilemmas within our policy, or at least the dilemmas of those who are in a position to make decisions about it. What we think, we're not decision makers that have particular significance towards policy. At least I'm not. Maybe you are.
I'm just a professor. So, professor here, we have a professor question from the audience. Another professor.
Thanks so much, everybody. And Will, thanks for organizing this. I have a question for you guys. This about the framing of the war and the context of this whole discussion, because the whole discussion so far is in a.
Is your microphone?
That's on.
Oh, it's on? Okay, go.
Yeah.
Is that louder? Better?
Yeah.
All right.
Hold it closer.
The context so far is as if this is a very conventional war. I mean, not in the sense of conventional weapons or versus nuclear war, but in the sense of a great power conflict with a proxy state stuck in between. But if we think about this as a genocidal war, then a lot of the conversation that we're having changes pretty dramatically. And I know that many of you don't. I mean, I either know you guys or I follow you on social media or I read your work. So I know that many of you pay a lot of attention to these questions. But my first question is just how would a lot of what we said so far change if that's the framework? And I wanted just to draw attention specifically to a couple of things that have been on the table here. I mean, so one is this question of even just things like proxy wars and should we call it a proxy war or not? And I'm curious because in a room like this, I'm pretty comfortable using terms correctly in the sense of it's political science correct. So that's pretty indisputable. The same way that I don't think it was, and Jesse and I have had this conversation before. I don't think that the Donbass war was, by political science definitions, not a civil war. It's hard to argue about that in a political science sense. But both those things are incredibly offensive to Ukrainians, right? To call this a proxy war and call that a civil war, and the arguments for that are clear cut too from outside of political science, right? I mean, so this feeds into the bigger question that you were raising, Jesse, in terms of when we have these conversations, what we should and shouldn't say. And the political science definitional one is fairly narrow, but the bigger one to me is this question of like how much is it bad to have some sort of common line in terms of where you go and where you don't go in arguments right now. And that's an argument that gets a lot. There's kind of too much groupthink, and people aren't willing to challenge the NATO lines, which I personally think that's totally not true. But even if it is true, if it's a genocidal war, then the rules change about that, don't they? Because this isn't just a question of great powers and we got to deal with our own liberty first or whatever it might be. I mean, this is a question of there's a lot of people who don't seem to get the fundamentals of this war. And when any of you guys speak out loud with a public audience, you have a huge influence, right? And so if you waver, then that affects people, right? People who don't really understand this situation go, oh yeah, I saw that crazy guy on social media, and now, so-and-so is saying something sort of similar, even if all you're doing is saying, yeah, that's, I can see it two ways. I don't have an easy solution to this because I think it's horrific to say something like we shouldn't be honest in public. But I do think this is a very, very different situation than anything else faced since World War II. And so I'm curious to hear how you guys think that changes any of this discussion. Thanks so much.
All right, so I'll take a first cut since it was at least partially directed at me. I think you're raising a serious question that I don't have a glib answer to. And to the extent that I do have a glib flip answer, it's that I don't have a presence on social media precisely to avoid some of this stuff and try to keep my lanes separate so that when I'm doing policy conversation, I know what the conversation in the audience is. And when I do my academic conversation, it is the same. And I do that in part because of exactly the concerns that you're talking about. But the point about it being deeply offensive to well-organized constituencies to talk about this war in any way other than the official line is a serious one, and the issues are extremely emotional. And I'm going to say two things here and then I will pass the mic because I'm not trying to dodge your question. It's a serious one. The first is that I think it is important, and this is not to whitewash anything, but it is important to state for the record that the issues are just as emotional on the other side of this war. And I know that that is not something that we want to hear because we want to hear that everyone in Russia is brainwashed by Russian media and Russian media narrative is wrong. And that might all be factually true, but the emotions are real. The emotions on the Russian side of this war are real. And their reading of human history is internally consistent. And I'm loath to say this, but I think it is a little bit of a strategic mistake for the United States to have a theory of victory in this war that requires Russians en masse to understand that their version of history is wrong. I think that that's just a big ask in terms of the ability of the United States to reverse engineer another society's understanding of its own history. I think that nationalism has taught us some things about countries' ability to manipulate their own social memory, and Russians are real manipulated at this point. So the emotions on their side are real, and that's all I'm trying to say. If I could make Tim Snyder get more links, I would get Tim Snyder to have more links. I do think that this war's a genocidal war. I do think that it is a colonial war. And I think American diplomatic talking points could benefit from the amplification of those themes if they were handled with great care. But I'm positive the Department of Defense is the wrong agent for making that happen. And that's why this conversation has gone the way it has. The second point that I'm going to make is that I think it's important for academics to self-censor ideas that are not politically useful and that are likely to be misunderstood. And I think that that is the reason that you have not really written about corruption problems in Ukraine since the war started, not because you forgot about the corruption problems in Ukraine, but because it's not politically useful right now. And I changed the last chapter of my book and the title of my book because it's not politically useful right now. It is primarily of historical interest that you could have thought about the Donbass War as a civil war between 2014 and 2022, but who cares? That's OBE, right? And so that I'm not walking around beating a drum on those themes because I don't think it's politically useful. And I think that's my responsibility. I think academics are actually responsible not only for the intended academic cloistered use of our language, but also the likely misinterpretation of our language if we're the kind of people who tweet and try to get retweeted. And it's a dodge for me to say that I'm not on Twitter, so I'm not trying to get retweeted, but I'm meeting you on the ground that you defined.
But is it politically useful for members of a major U.S. political party to raise issues about corruption and provision of military supplies to Ukraine?
I'm not going to speak to that. I was directing academics.
All right.
So as somebody on social media with a small following compared to other people on the panel, I will say that there are many firsts in this war. And actually I engage my personal views about this war on social media because I can. I'm a student of war in general and understand that population opinion ideals about what's going on, that immediacy of information, the veil between war and the world is gone. And that changes a lot of the frameworks in which we study wars. When I can discover a genocide, an entire village of mass murder, torture, raping babies to death, and I can discover that immediately, it matters as opposed to discovering it afterwards. And it is actually driving political decisions. As back to the, let's say, norms instead of rules, in which we make political risk calculations, they're driven by the populist concern of the genocide. There are genocides that have happened in many locations recently, but there are so many firsts in this war. The first of a nuclear-armed nation entering another country and committing genocide because it has nuclear weapons. The first where, again, another sitting member of the UN Security Council uses war crimes as a method of warfare and says, yeah, no, I know you got all those rules that we all agreed to, but I'm not going to follow any of them. There's no accountability to what soldiers do. They're rewarded for doing genocide. I engage in elevating that, and if I can, that's great, because I want that to then bleed into political leaders who make the decision on, okay, this month we're going to give 4 artillery systems. And that's what it was in March. We'll give you 4 artillery. And as a military guy, so Bucha happens. Okay, we'll give you 12. But that's the immediacy that I think is this. This is the first war. While it's not the first TikTok war, it's not the first media war. It's the first war where we can live it in real time. And I think that matters to our risk adherence, our deterrence theory. It's useful to study, but I believe it's a genocidal war, but it's not just that. It's a test of the multi-international organizations we created after World War II to say never again. Never again will we allow all these things to happen, and Russia's putting that to the test. I'm going to test all that.
Okay, I want to get to another audience member.
Hi, so thanks for being here. Very interesting. So I have 2 questions. First one, so when I'm broadly thinking about how Russia starts this war and how they're conducting it, it's very much is a limited war. Even though they have committed a lot more now, like mobilizing, they still frame everything in very like partial mobilization. They end mobilization. They don't really do this, right? They haven't committed that much of official budget to waging the war. They haven't mobilized industry. So this is, at least rhetorically, and what we can see is not very much a total war yet. So, and I'm just thinking, like in sum total, how do you think about this kind of attitude towards this war from Kremlin? Is this a position of strength or position of weakness for them? I mean, it's a bit of speculation whether we can say in how far they can recognize own weaknesses, but it's still like, so this was my first sort of question. Second one, broadly, what do you think of Wagner Group? Because so we sort of know that on the one hand they do get all the all the gear from the Ministry of Defense, and maybe GRU, like GRU, is working with them. But do you see a potential for something actually separate, like autonomous rising there? And what kind of role in the combat do you see them playing? And yeah, maybe that. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, so.
I was going to answer real quickly about like, it's no different than when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003. Like, we didn't want to use 500,000 troops. We wanted to use like 50 to 100,000. Like, it's, I guess you could say that's a weird modern way of wanting to fight, which is use the least amount of force to achieve your objectives that you think you can actually get. And I think that's just it's a military equation. I can't really answer like your second question. Sorry.
I'll jump in briefly. On mobilization, Russia is actually mobilizing the economy. It just did it very late in the war, like it did everything else very late in this war. This is why I say that, I don't think Putin's necessarily a master strategist, but he is a phenomenal procrastinator. And usually when things go wrong, he procrastinates for a very long time to make politically difficult decisions and waits for all his options to become worse. And he's done this fairly consistently throughout conflicts. He did this in 2014 too, in spring to summer of 2014. On mobilization, I'll tell you, it will be interesting to see what it does, but it's going to have significant disruption on the economy. I think that Russia is actually doing very much what it can do. The real question is, at this point, will it reap benefits from military and economic mobilization down the line? Now, a time frame to look at for military, I think 3 to 4 months, and for economic, actually much further down on mobilization and production. But many Russian defense industries went to double and triple shifts over the summer. But they will have many supply chain issues as well. You cannot just mobilize productions. We ourselves are discovering. You can't just magic wand multiple production lines into existence. If you've had one company that's been handling a lot of the process, you're not going to get there all that fast. On Wagner, the role of Wagner really expanded since May when they were taking Popasna. In many ways, you see them. There are 2 Wagners. There's Wagner as assault troops in many ways as well equipped as even Russian airborne. being used for assault purposes. And there's this disposable Wagner of PMCs that are essentially prisoners and other types that are largely being used as cannon fodder. I don't know. I don't know how best to split them. Like real Wagner and cannon fodder Wagner, I guess is the way I call it. But the point being is that yes, the role is growing. The longer the war's gone on, the less cohesive the Russian military effort has been. The less of the regular Russian military there was actually this war. It became much more mobilized LDNR personnel, Wagner fighters, and volunteers who formed volunteer battalions with Russian military equipment. But although Wagner's had some successes, you've seen they've been fighting outside of Bakhmut for like the last 4 months in a fairly near pointless and strategic offensive, in the sense that it's just completely out of line with the rest of Russian strategy at this point. You do see that Wagner is part and parcel of an internal political fight within Russian Byzantine politics, of Prigozhin and people associated with him, sensing weakness amongst other elites in the Russian system, okay, like Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and trying to come after them, embarrass the Ministry of Defense, and suggest that, look, Wagner's making gains. Wagner's actually doing better than the regular Russian troops. And the whole point of that is actually to advance him and to buy himself more space and more resources within the system, and maybe actually make something separate of Wagner as sort of its own quasi-entity. I don't know where that's going to go. I'm just sort of observing the tendencies.
All right. Well, there's a lot to talk about, and thank you all very much for coming down the rabbit hole of Ukraine conflict, and thanking you on behalf of Northwestern University and West Point's Modern War Institute's Irregular Warfare Initiative, and Princeton's Empirical Studies of Conflict, and our funders for this wonderful spread of food, which I'm sorry for those of you online universe will not be able to share with us. So that wraps up today's program, and I thank you, and I thank all of our participants very much for this very informative session.